In the mid-20th century, a small island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula found itself at a crossroads of history. Singapore, a mere dot on the map, faced an uncertain future as it was expelled from Malaysia in 1965. This was a time of great turmoil. The island was plagued by social strife, economic instability, and a lack of natural resources. The population, a diverse fabric of ethnicities, grappled with high unemployment and widespread poverty. The slums were home to the majority, and drug addiction was rampant. The withdrawal of British forces threatened to remove the economic lifeline of the island, casting a shadow over its viability as an independent nation. Despite offering support, Singapore's neighbors seemed to turn their backs, leaving the fledgling nation isolated. The scenario painted a bleak picture of Singapore's survival, let alone prosperity. Yet, against all odds, Singapore transformed itself. From the depths of despair and the brink of collapse, it rose to become a global powerhouse. Today, it stands as a testimony to what visionary leadership and relentless pursuit of progress can achieve. So, how did Singapore navigate from being a struggling post-colonial state to one of the wealthiest nations on Earth? In the late 18th century, the British East India Company emerged as a colossal corporate entity, surpassing even the financial might of its home country, Britain. It wielded immense power, boasting a private army and governing lands that housed a staggering 1/5 of the world's population. The company's vast wealth was largely accrued through global trade, with Chinese tea being its most prized commodity. To fund this tea trade, the company cultivated and sold vast quantities of opium in northern India, a practice that would have lasting historical implications. The lifeline of this trade was the Malacca Strait, a slender maritime passage that soon became the company's golden route, accounting for half of its revenue. This strategic waterway was essential for the company's operations, but it was not without its challenges. The region was dominated by the Dutch, who had maintained a tight grip on local trade for 2 centuries, leaving little room for competition. Despite the potential for conflict, a determined company official, Sir Thomas Raffles, boldly established a port on the then undeveloped island of Singapore. This move was strategic. Singapore's position at the tip of the Malay Peninsula was perfect for controlling the passage through the Malacca Strait. After negotiations in Europe, the Dutch, who were initially opposed, chose not to obstruct the British claim to the territory. Singapore was destined for a unique role. To differentiate it from other ports and attract global traders, it was designated a free port. This meant that no taxes were levied on business or port activities, a stark contrast to the heavily taxed ports in the vicinity. This decision proved to be a masterstroke, as traders flocked to Singapore, drawn by the promise of greater profits and fewer bureaucratic hurdles. The establishment of Singapore as a free port was a game-changer in global trade. It not only cemented the British East India Company's dominance in the region, but also laid the foundations for Singapore's future as a bustling hub of commerce and trade. The island's strategic location, coupled with its free port status, propelled its growth into a major entrepot, facilitating trade within both the British Empire and Asia. In just 4 years, Singapore transformed into a magnet for tens of thousands of traders from diverse regions such as China, British Malaya, and India. The allure of conducting business without the burden of taxes drew ships in droves, eager to partake in the wealth that Singapore's tax-free environment offered. The city's rapid expansion and the lack of stringent administrative control led to the proliferation of illicit activities, including the slave trade, gambling, opium dens, and violence. Despite these challenges, Singapore's role as a key international trading post continued to strengthen. The launch of the Suez Canal in Egypt marked a pivotal moment, significantly reducing the maritime journey between England and China by 5,000 miles, or just over 8,000 kilometers, for those using the metric system. This reduction in distance not only cut down on costs, but also surged the demand for shipping services. The new route now favored the Malacca Strait over the Sunda Strait, resulting in increased traffic for Singapore's port. By 1867, the significance of Singapore was formally acknowledged when it was declared a crown colony of the British Empire. The introduction of rubber plantations in British Malaya and the soaring global demand for tin, which was plentiful in the region, further elevated Singapore's status. It became not just a transit point to China, but also the central hub for the riches of Southeast Asia. Resources extracted from the peninsula were sent to Singapore for processing and subsequent global distribution, fostering a mutually beneficial economic relationship with British Malaya. The city's importance attracted a larger British military presence, which in turn generated industries related to the dockyards and services for military personnel. By the turn of the century, Singapore had grown to a bustling city of over 200,000 inhabitants, enjoying a more prosperous life than those in neighboring regions. Yet, this period of uninterrupted growth was not to last forever. Throughout the 20th century, Singapore's distance from Europe, spanning 6,000 miles or 9,600 kilometers, did not shield it from the widespread conflicts that followed. With the onset of World War II, the Japanese Empire rapidly expanded, conquering territories in its path. By December 1941, the Japanese forces began their invasion of British Malaya, and within a mere 2 months, they were on the brink of entering Singapore. Contrary to directives from London, Singapore capitulated on February 15, 1942. The subsequent 3 years brought about immense suffering and devastation to the island. When the war's momentum shifted and liberation arrived in 1945, the effort to reclaim the island resulted in the demolition of most of its structures. The once prized gem of Southeast Asia was reduced to a charred heap of debris, left in ruins by the war and further neglected by a weakened British Empire. The reconstruction efforts in Singapore were disorganized and lacked regulation. Makeshift slums began to overrun the island, essential services remained unrepaired, and the scourge of violence and opium addiction ravaged its citizens. A travel publication once described Singapore as a place of absolute squalor and destitution, a sight one had to witness firsthand to comprehend fully. Over the years, the British did little to foster unity or assimilation among Singapore's varied and crowded populace. There was no sense of a unified Singaporean identity, as each community lived in separation, vying for resources, adhering to their customs, and often harboring conflicting interests with other groups. Faced with dire living conditions and escalating joblessness, these communities began to clash, exacerbating the already dire state of affairs in Singapore. Singapore's long-standing connection with the British Empire was largely untroubled due to its minimal resources, which shielded it from the exploitation other colonies faced. However, the British Empire's inability to defend Singapore during the war, coupled with a faltering economy and escalating social unrest, sparked a desire for independence among the people, especially as decolonization gained momentum worldwide. The people of Singapore rallied behind Lee Kuan Yew, a lawyer who had studied in Britain. He founded the People's Action Party, PAP for short, and won a few seats in the 1955 local elections. Lee became the face of the independence movement, which initially led to a crackdown by London. As the British public's support for decolonization grew, the process towards independence began. In 1959, Lee was elected Prime Minister with the vision of joining British Malaya, which he saw as vital for Singapore's survival. The economies of Singapore and British Malaya were closely linked, and Singapore needed support to manage its defense and economic recovery. The union was realized on September 16, 1963, when British Malaya, North Borneo, Sarawak, and Singapore formed the Federation of Malaysia. Yet, the election of a Malaysian party that favored ethnic Malays presented a challenge for ethnically diverse Singapore. Tensions led to violent outbreaks, and the PAP, contradicting their earlier stance, participated in federal elections, promoting a fair and multicultural society. Singapore's presence was seen as a threat by the ruling party, leading to its expulsion from Malaysia just 2 years after the merger. Suddenly independent, Singapore faced the daunting task of self-reliance. Lee Kuan Yew was tasked with building a nation from a population lacking a collective identity and steering it toward prosperity. He had to address job creation without natural resources, elevate a significant portion of the population from poverty, provide housing and education, and set them on a path to a better future. The departure of the British military further strained the economy and job market. With Malaysia threatening economic isolation to the north and Indonesia's potential aggression to the south, Lee Kuan Yew was determined to transform Singapore into a modern state, even if it required strict governance. Addressing the civil disorder while also solidifying the PAP's hold on power was the initial challenge for Lee. The government restricted personal liberties, prohibited free expression, and detained political adversaries without a trial. Harsh penalties were imposed for acts of unrest, substance abuse, and even minor offenses like chewing gum, vandalism, and inebriation in public. The government's stringent measures extended to severe legal actions against dissenters. Various groups, including religious radicals, pro-communist factions, and Malays favoring reunification with Malaysia, faced suppression or harsher consequences. Lee opted for an authoritarian governance style to manage the deep-seated ethnic and societal tensions. Despite the severe nature of these measures, they proved effective in reducing violence and bringing stability to the country. He believed that the citizens would overlook the erosion of their civil liberties in exchange for economic growth and societal harmony. Although elections continued nominally, they were so heavily manipulated that Singapore effectively became a single-party state under the PAP, a status that persists. With the social and political landscape now stable, Lee embarked on a significant economic transformation. A primary focus was the housing crisis, as 70% of Singaporeans lived in substandard temporary shelters without basic amenities. A contentious policy was enacted, allowing the state to acquire land inexpensively for the construction of extensive affordable housing developments. Lee was initially drawn to the British model of social support, but he aimed to foster self-reliance among his citizens, rather than perpetual dependency on the government. To give Singaporeans a vested interest in the nation's wealth and encourage them to maintain their properties, they were motivated to purchase their apartments at accessible prices. The affordability of these homes was made possible by the Central Provident Fund, a mandatory savings scheme that initially served as a pension fund. Lee adapted this fund to enable its use for housing purchases. Over time, the mandatory savings rate was increased to 25% of an individual's salary, with an equivalent contribution from employers, leading Singapore to achieve the highest savings-to-income ratio globally. This strategy, combined with the low-cost availability of state-built housing, was a resounding success. It eradicated slum living conditions, allowing most citizens to become homeowners. Today, 80% of Singaporeans reside in homes they own, which were initially constructed by the government, helping them sidestep the exorbitant housing costs seen in other densely populated cities like Hong Kong. Providing housing alone was insufficient without employment opportunities. Lacking natural resources, established manufacturing industries, and facing trade reluctance from neighboring countries, Lee recognized that foreign investment was crucial for economic expansion. In keeping with Singapore's historical role, the government maintained low taxes and regulations, offering substantial incentives such as a decade-long tax exemption for businesses. To maintain competitive labor costs, unions were prohibited, and businesses were encouraged to dismiss employees during strikes. The government heavily invested in infrastructure and developed expansive industrial zones. Since the domestic market was limited, policies were implemented to orient the economy towards exports. Singapore's strategic location, port facilities, and business-friendly policies attracted simple, labor-intensive foreign businesses, especially as investors were deterred from Hong Kong and Taiwan due to political unrest. Within a mere decade, Singapore achieved virtually full employment, and the economy was thriving with an annual growth rate of 13%. The country continued to adopt aggressive capitalist policies to attract foreign investment, becoming one of the most business-friendly nations globally. To ensure the economy didn't become overly dependent on government intervention, Lee took bold measures against corruption, including severe penalties and offering some of the highest salaries worldwide for government officials, which helped make Singapore one of the least corrupt nations. Lee's vision extended beyond basic manufacturing. He recognized that the nation's most valuable asset was its people. He invested in technical education, subsidized worker training by foreign companies, and ensured a healthy population through modern healthcare facilities. This attracted more specialized industries, leading to higher wages, increased savings, and more government funds for reinvestment in education, creating a cycle of productivity gains. By the 1980s, Singapore had diversified into high-value industries such as petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, advanced electronics, shipbuilding, and chemical production. Despite its lack of natural resources, it became the world's third-largest refiner of petroleum by importing raw materials, processing them, and exporting the finished products. Singapore's financial sector also saw rapid growth, strategically positioned between the closing of American markets and the opening of European ones. As Asia experienced significant growth, Singapore became the central hub for logistics and finance, channeling foreign investment throughout the region. With its pro-financial policies, Singapore emerged as the fourth-largest financial center in the world. Singapore's modest origins meant it lacked a native entrepreneurial class with the capital and expertise to establish major companies that could compete globally. To bridge this gap and spur growth, Lee assembled a team of skilled bureaucrats and global businessmen to create productive state-owned enterprises, such as Singapore Airlines. State enterprises, often associated with inefficiency, were profit-driven from the start in Singapore. The government's low corruption levels, Lee's readiness to close unprofitable ventures, and the absence of unions, which kept costs down, contributed to their remarkable success. In the 1990s, the government began partially privatizing these profitable entities, offering Singaporeans preferential rates to purchase shares. These enterprises not only diversified the economy, but also addressed market voids. The profits were invested in a sovereign wealth fund, which supported healthcare, infrastructure, and education enhancements. Today, Singapore stands as one of the wealthiest, most progressive, and competitive economies globally. It boasts the second largest port, ranks as the second most business-friendly country, and secures the third highest level of foreign direct investment. Singaporeans enjoy affordable housing and top-tier healthcare, and their students rank highest in academic performance. Under Lee Kuan Yew's leadership, the government effectively enacted policies based on practicality rather than ideology, contributing to Singapore's enduring prosperity. This progress came at the expense of political and personal freedoms. Despite the challenges of its authoritarian rule, the results are undeniable. The centralized authority enabled Singapore to amplify its strengths and mitigate its weaknesses. Singapore's strategic position on a crucial global shipping route, its ability to capitalize on the rise of globalization in the latter half of the 20th century, and the fortunate leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, a leader who was largely wise and benevolent, played pivotal roles in its success. While it's easy for those in Western nations to critique Singapore's methods, it's important to recognize that these countries' ideals and institutions have evolved over centuries, whereas developing nations like Singapore have had to progress at a much faster pace. Singapore's unique trajectory is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather a tailored approach that has proven ideal for its specific circumstances. Intrigued by Singapore's economic success story? Let us know your takeaways in the comments, and join our community by subscribing for regular updates on fascinating topics like this one.